Thank you. Welcome back to our program. We're very excited. The Thomas Ferguson Lecture was made possible by a generous contribution from Medtronic, and we thank Medtronic for its ongoing support of the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. The lecture was established 20 years ago in 2020 to recognize and honor Dr. Thomas B. Ferguson, a remarkable man and surgeon who had profound influence on our society. He was a founding member of the STS, editor of the Annals of Thoracic Surgery from 1994 until 2000. He also was one of the only people to serve as both the president of the Society of Thoracic Surgeons and the American Association for Thoracic Surgery. The topic of this year's Ferguson Lecture is Making Evidence Great Again, and our presenter has a keen interest in clinical outcomes research using large registries, as well as in myocardial metabolism and protection in cardiac surgery. After earning his medical degree from Naples Medical School, Dr. Domenico Pagano undertook fellowships from the Royal College of Surgeons and the European Board of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery. He currently is a consultant in cardiothoracic surgery at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham in the United Kingdom. He's also a professor of the University of Birmingham and Secretary General of the European Association for Cardiothoracic Surgery, and, in his spare time, an STS International Board Director. Dr. Pagano has been involved with numerous research studies and has participated in the development of clinical practice guidelines, including blood management in cardiac surgery and myocardial revascularization. But most importantly, he is a thoughtful, insightful, and great friend of cardiothoracic surgery and the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. And it gives me great pleasure to invite him to the podium as our honorary lecturer for the Ferguson Lecture. Please welcome Dr. Pagano.
Good luck. Thank you.
Have fun.
Good. Thank you. Right. Wow. Good afternoon. Bob, it's an enormous privilege to be invited to deliver such a prestigious lecture. I am very grateful to the organizers, to Dr. Higgins, to the STS for this kind of invitation. I hope that I can entertain you for the next hour. There are two things, though, that I won't do. One, I'm not wearing a red hat. Second, seeing the effect of the lectern had on Bob earlier, I'm going to stay away from it as much as I can. Data underpins clinical evidence, which in turn is used to make decisions about the quality of care delivered and to choose the best treatment options for our patients. Good quality data and evidence are necessary prerequisites to inform trustworthy processes. I'm going to leave that slide up because that's usually the fastest slide in a presentation. I hope we can rehearse today concepts like professionalism, transparency, propriety, and trust, which are as important today as they've never been. I would like to start with a notable example of individual professionalism that made an enormous contribution by pioneering the culture of clinical outcome data collection and analysis to improve the delivery of surgical care to patients. Whilst I accept that most of you are familiar with Dr. Codden's work, I came to know his contribution to the concept of clinical outcome research in my early career, and he provided me with an inspiring role model. He joined the surgical staff at Massachusetts General and became a member of the Harvard faculty. Whilst there, he instituted the first mortality and morbidity conferences. However, in 1914, the hospital refused his plan for evaluating surgeons' competence, and he lost the staff privileges. Codman chaired a meeting at the Suffolk District Surgical Society where the mayor of Boston, a champion of public health initiative, was in attendance. He took the podium and unveiled the poster he'd commissioned, which you can see in this slide. The poster depicts an ostrich with the head buried in the sand, signifying a patient who laid golden eggs in blissful ignorance of the results. The board of trustees, which you can see at the back, wondering whether she would still lay eggs if she knew the truth. You can imagine what happened to Codman after that presentation. To support his end results theory, Dr. Codman made public the end results of his own hospital, which he called the end results, in a privately published book, A Study in Hospital Efficiency. He recorded the results of 337 patients which were discharged between 1911 and 1916. But he did more than that. He recorded 123 errors, and he catalogued the errors in different categories. Errors due to lack of knowledge or skills, error due to surgical judgment, lack of care of equipment, lack of diagnostic skills, and he also recorded 4 catastrophic events which led to death. He was also pioneering and introduced the concept of long-term follow-up. Well, these are concepts that are rehearsed and are used now quite routinely. This is an example of the phase of care mortality, which was pioneered by Frank Shannon in Michigan and is central to a quality initiative. In 1917, the American College of Surgeons, with the help of Codman, established and assigned the minimal standard for hospitals. This contained things that today will seem very strange. Each hospital should have a medical staff. I think we all agree with that. Medical staff should be chosen on graduation from medical school, competency, and interestingly, character. This was probably the beginning of the teamwork exercise in which you need to get on at work, you need to work together. There should be regular staff meetings to review the cases. Medical records should be written and filed for all cases, and each hospital should have a clinical laboratory and a radiological section. In 1918, the American College of Surgeons begins a nationwide survey of on-site inspections for the hospitals. And this is one of the cards that were used for that. You can see at the top the date, March 10, 1920, and you can see in yellow some of the interesting comments that were passed by the investigating team. For instance, only nurses' notes, some lab reports, operation sheets kept on the floor, and no filing system with records kept in boxes. So this was the basis for that assessment. At the American College Annual Conference, held in New York at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the team that did the investigation reviewed the report. This showed that only 89 out of 692 hospitals surveyed had actually met the minimum standard. Here, there was a dilemma. What to do with this data? Shall we stand up and present it, or the choice they made was that every copy of the report was carried to the hotel furnace room and solemnly cremated. Fear prevailed. Fear is always an important determinant for lack of progress and particularly gets in the way of change. What was the end result for Codman? He was ostracized by his peers. He received no referrals. He had few patients and little income. He was interned in an unmarked grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, but I'm told from the last visit I had in Mass General that actually that's been put okay. He wrote about himself before dying, "Honors, except those I've trust upon myself, are conspicuously absent, but I'm able to enjoy the hypothesis that I may receive some more from a more receptive generation." And that did happen. The American College of Surgeons continued the program of accreditation, which then went into the Joint Commission. But at the basis of all of this, to help us to make the right decisions, accuracy and completeness of data underpinning this process has to be high. So let's see an example of where the data plays a major role in making some important decision that could be right or wrong according to the quality of the data. Let me give you a little background. This is about the review of children's heart surgery in UK. This was a review of the services which was requested by the Society of Cardiothoracic Surgery in Great Britain and Ireland in 2007. To address individual surgeons' workload, the on-call arrangements, the increasing complexity of surgery and the specialization. It was supported by all the Royal Colleges and by also other specialist associations, including parents' groups. He had political support. It was conducted through the Department of Health, was led by clinicians, and was reported the outcomes in 2013. He suggested that the number of pediatric congenital unit, the congenital unit, should go from 11 to 7. But legal challenge followed straight after. Leeds General Infirmary was one of the hospitals which was earmarked for closure for the pediatric unit. But there were growing concerns. In early March 2013, there was a judicial review which ruled that the decision to close Leeds was legally flawed. In the next 2 weeks, getting close to Easter, a long weekend, the NHS medical director receives some information. One, a competitor unit claimed that Leeds was avoiding high-risk cases and has still high mortality. Two, a very senior cardiac surgeon in the land rang the medical director and said there are problems in Leeds. Easter was coming up. There were only locums available, no senior consultants available to cover 4-day bank holiday. The Wednesday before Easter, the NHS medical director was sent risk-adjusted mortality data by the National Clinical Director for Cardiovascular Disease, who also was concerned. So let's see what data the medical director received. He received data, standardized mortality ratio, and you can see that LGI looked like was an outlier compared to the rest of the unit. So you are the medical director, 4 days before Easter, you've got a difficult decision to make. Should you keep the unit open and investigate that signal, or should you close the unit and investigate the signal? What played on the mind of the medical director were several things. The vivid memory of the Bristol scandal with congenital cardiac surgery in the late 90s. The report from Sir Kennedy, who said that actually Bristol was awash with data and clinicians were not doing anything despite the data was already showing problems. And of course, the problem, if you keep open and something happens over the bank holiday weekend and you're aware of that data, you can have public fallout. But it becomes even more complex. What do you do if you investigate? Well, that review was called Safe and Sustainable. Now, on one end, Leeds was earmarked to close. Now there is a judicial review, and now you're going to close it again. You can imagine the public fallout with that. But you could also use the precautionary principle. Very difficult position for the medical director. Whatever he chose was always difficult. What he did, he chose, the choice of the team was one of the precautionary principle. Operation stopped, and the investigation started. But of course, as expected, the press and the public outcry, as predicted, came out. And you can see the head of the medical director was asked for, and there was quite shock and awe for this decision, particularly for the timing of this decision. A few days later, the investigations on mortality for pediatric cardiac surgery in England, led by the National Institute of Clinical Outcome Research, published the outcomes. The first thing that was quite obvious is that Leeds General Hospital had submitted in August 2012 missing data for the weight, and the missing data ratio was quite high, 34.7%. Now, the weight was a very important factor in the risk adjustment scoring system with a heavy weight. Again, the weight of the baby is something that is readily available. It's probably one of the fields that one would hope is 100% filled in, because otherwise you can't set the cardiopulmonary bypass parameters. When the fields were filled in, the reanalysis took place, and Leeds was no longer an outlier. In the report, there were some recommendations. Whilst data submission by the individual trust to NICO had been variable, Leeds had been underperforming consistently, according to NICO. And also, they suggested that the data submission could be considered as a measure of the organizational commitment to a quality service delivery. Is it reasonable to expect that the data submitted is accurate and complete? Did we have an episode here where incomplete, inaccurate data actually could potentially cause harm or would cause distress to a service and the families? But data is also used in innovation. Advances in medicine are driven by evidence. Patients benefit, professions change. Isoniazid saw the end of surgery for tuberculosis. H2 blockers heralded the end of peptic ulcer surgery. And stents increased and improved options for patients with coronary artery disease. In the West, we enjoy a long life expectancy. Among other things, this is due to public health policy and research in which industry contributes significantly. In fact, the financial investment and the entrepreneurial approach towards innovation and education from industry has brought significant improvement to patient treatments, in helping doctors and healthcare professionals to deliver better care, to improve the quality of life and extend the life expectancy in many fields of medicine. My mind goes to vaccination programs. You need to think about the smallpox, treating heart attacks with primary angioplasty, improving the survival for cancer driven by a series of trials, and improving the diabetes. Also, they play a major role in supporting medical training and medical education. But let's see what happens when this data and innovation are applied, for instance, to class 3 devices, and what happens, what we expect when there is an innovation, a technical innovation that comes from industry and needs to come into the cycle of therapy. So a new device usually comes as a result of a capital investment in research and development from multinational industries or from a startup. Clinical trials, properly designed, need to look at the efficacy and the safety of this new treatment compared to the gold standard treatment usually. The data then gets published through a dissemination process in high impact journals with a robust peer review process. Regulators play a major role. They should play an independent safety and efficacy scrutiny. They should be protecting ourselves. Clinical adoption of the new treatments are usually through clinical guidelines recommendation, and the real-world outcomes should be monitored with robust clinical registries. But more recently, we've had some trouble, and we had some, we've seen some potential issue with clinical trials, and in particular with some industry-funded clinical trials.
And Mike Reed, I'm a cardiac surgeon from the Houston Methodist Hospital in the PI and the low-risk trial. Trials are usually set up in a very specific way and run usually to try to get a positive endpoint. Trials are usually set up in a very specific way and run usually to try to get a positive endpoint.
So there was Michael Riordan. He's a very senior clinician, a very senior trialist, honestly raising some concerns candidly about some of these trials when he was interviewed at the SCTS meeting last year. So the issue here is, what is the quality of these trials? Is it true that these trials have got different bias compared to the non-industry funded trials? Well, some of the answers come from this Cochrane review, and the important bit is that usually industry-funded trials are generally well run. They're seriously funded properly. Industry always knows where are the best places to receive the best care, which is the best way to do trials. However, when you compare industry to non-industry sponsored trials, you're more likely to have more favorable efficacy results. You're also more likely to have favorable conclusions. And the authors really suggested that there is an industry bias that cannot be explained by standard risk of bias assessment. So how can you get bias into the clinical trials? Well, the introduction of bias could take place in the pre-study phase, during the design, in the post-study phase. Let's see some of these in the pre-study phases, for instance, reporting the planned methods and analysis of the study, during the study, under-reporting of the statistical analysis, not sharing the analytical code, which is an important thing of transparency. The data should be open, and the analytical code should be shared so that you look at the reproducibility of the analysis, and also in the post-study interpretation, for instance, not reporting the conflicts of interest, under-reporting the methods, selective reporting of pre-specified clinical outcomes, and so on. Specifically, when we look at the trial design, there are a number of ways that a bias could be introduced. Now, for instance, the choice of particular endpoints which should favor the new treatment against the old treatment, a statistical design particularly with clinically unacceptable inferiority margin, although statistically you can reach those inferiority margin. Short-term follow-up, when you're comparing to a procedure that is known to have a better long-term outcomes, unblinded endpoint committees, and more recently, we're seeing more and more the use of S-treated analysis. When you do S-treated analysis, you take away one of the best things about randomization, which is that you know that if the result is one way, it's not likely to due to chance, but when you have S-treated analysis, you are making trials that are more like observational trials. So the trends is the trials on the surge. There has been a doubling of the clinical trials between 2006 and 2014. Per se, this is a good thing. It's underpinning clinical evidence-based medicine. But actually, there's been a sizable decrease in NIH-funded trials in the US, and a sizable increase in the industry-funded trials. So trials could produce inaccurate evidence. Now, inaccurate evidence may become the source of wrong behavior, leading to inappropriate decision-making, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. This is to introduce the concept of meme. In 1976, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Selfish Gene, said that human evolution is due to two things: gene evolution, which we all understand, but also a transmittable cultural behavior, which he called meme, which also said is catchy and infectious. Just as genes propagate themselves by leaping from body to body by sperm or eggs, so memes propagate themselves leaping from brain to brain by a process of imitation. This process is now amplified by tools like social media. If we're looking for a simple definition of meme in line with the title of my talk, perhaps we can call them fake news. This is the story of Andrew Wakefield, a doctor in London, and Brian Deere, a very tenacious investigative journalist. Andrew Wakefield, in February 1998, published in the prestigious Lancet, an early report where he had identified a chronic enterocolitis in children that may be related to a form of autism. He said, in most cases, the onset of symptoms was after the MMR vaccination. But he also concluded further investigations are needed to examine this syndrome and its possible relation to the vaccine. He then went to the press and he said, this is a moral issue for me. I can't support the continuous use of these vaccines in combination. This was his doctor looking after the patients, and he wanted to do the best for his patients. But what were the problems with that report? But anybody can see that that report had a small sample size of 12. Anybody knew that the association between MMR vaccination and symptoms actually was made by the parents. And finally, the age of development of autism is similar to the age of MMR vaccination. So after a long investigation, what did Brian Deere report? Well, firstly, 2 years before the publication, Wakefield paid a lawyer to build the case for legal challenges after his paper was published, so that he could gain, through his wife, some money. And in fact, he profited £430,000, but this was not declared as a conflict to the Lancet when he did the paper. A year before, in 1997, publishing the paper, he had filed for a patent for a single measles vaccine, from which he was anticipating making over $1 million. The 12 children, actually, they were not random children. They were pre-selected through the MMI campaign groups. The General Medical Council, which is the licensing body for doctors in UK, ran an inquiry, and at the end of the inquiry showed that there was no evidence for all the findings that had been published, and also that the hospital ethics had not covered the procedures. So, as a result, vaccination for measles came down, incidence of measles went up. As the meme spread, so did the viruses. Vaccine hesitancy is a big problem. WHO put it in 2019 among the 10 threats to global health. 140,000 deaths in 2018, mostly children under 5 from measles, a disease that was almost eradicated with vaccinations. So what happened to Wakefield? What was his end result? Remember, he published the paper in 1998. 12 years later, it took 12 years for the General Medical Council to emit a verdict, where Wakefield was found to be dishonest, unethical, and callous. He was found guilty of criminal standards of proof for 36 charges, including the abuse of developmental children and dishonesty. The Lancet wasn't any faster than the GMC. It also took 12 years for the Lancet to fully retract the paper as utterly false. Wakefield was ousted from his business in Texas, and he was also erased from the General Medical Council, and this was the end of his career in medicine. Approximately 9,000 excess measles cases in UK between 2004 and 2014 as a result of this adverse publicity. Popular fears, fueled by disinformation, offer a fertile ground for populistic political movements to hook on and transform fears into votes, and therefore power. Here you've got the ex-Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini of one of the Italian governments coming out against vaccination. The Five Star Movement did the same, and anti-vax campaigns are still present, I know, in this country and in other places in the world. But this begs the question, the Lancet published their paper. Why do journals publish papers that actually have some methodological issues that worry us? Well, first of all, we know that trials now are published in major journal, major impact journal, and sometimes we find significant methodological issues. We've seen an increased number of industry-funded trials in major journals. The advantages for the journals are plenty. One is the increased impact and its revenue. 2 is the increased sale of reprints by industry. 3 is the large institutional subscriptions. This is a report from 2005 and 6, and you can see in red is the amount of income from the journals that come from sales of reprints. The British Medical Journal had a small proportion, 3% of its income, Lancet 41%, and the other major journal, including the New England Journal of Medicine, did not report. There was no transparency about this, although we know that in 2000 received an order from Merck of $700,000 for the Vioxx study that was published and then had to be retracted because the Vioxx was found to have a very poor benefit to risk ratio. We said that another important step in their cycle of innovation is the role of the regulators. The regulators need to play a role that is very important in keeping us safe. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in 2018 ran an investigation and reported on a number of things. Let's see what they say about how difficult it is to get market approval in Europe for a new device.
We wanted to really test the approval process for medical devices. If we would build a vaginal mesh that was so dangerous and so ridiculous, would we get it through? So we bought a net of mandarins and we went to the notified bodies and we said, would you approve this? And they didn't see any problem.
So, the European Regulatory Approval System, the CE mark, Conformité Européenne, it's a conformity mark for, with the health, safety and environmental standards in the European Union. It is given through notified bodies, of which there are more than 30 in different countries. The data between the notified bodies is not linked. You can apply for a market approval in one, you don't get it, you go to another one in another country, the two don't know what's happened, and you may get it in another country. And there is variable ownership of these notified bodies, sometimes funded directly from industry. What did the actual investigation report? First of all, obtaining a CE market approval was too easy and not always transparent. Secondly, undeclared significant conflicts of interest between industry and clinicians were hidden. Regulatory bodies did not disseminate information on problems with device, and more importantly, there were no registries to follow up patients to look in the post-market era what was happening with these devices. What about the Food and Drug Administration? Well, the FDA also needs to make a balanced choice between allowing patients to have the benefit early from the new therapies, and on the other hand, make sure that they are safe. Now, I'll give an example, which is the penicillin. Penicillin was discovered in 1928 in a laboratory in St. Mary's Hospital by Dr. Fleming in London. It took 20 years to have the penicillin available for everybody else, and thanks to the entrepreneurial approach of Pfizer at the time, who actually then made it available for mass production. Of course, the earlier you introduce a device or a treatment, the more you want a safety umbrella to monitoring whether there is anything wrong, so that you can continue to make sure that there is a benefit. The benefit-harm ratio is favorable. And therefore, you have a pre-market approval process, and you have a post-marketing monitoring system. So, Class 3 devices, there are 3 classes of devices. Class 3 are the high-risk devices. They're called Class 3 and high-risk because they can cause significant harm or death if they go wrong. To give a simple example, valve prosthesis, coronary stents are all Class 3 devices. They did not need market approval before 76. It's only after 76 they need market approval. But if you had devices on the market before 76, without producing any clinical data, you could do some paperwork, the 501(k), it could be grandfathered to remain on the market after 76. And once you were on the market after 76, if you change and make modification, as long as that device does what it needs to do, like a pacemaker stimulating cardiac myocytes, then you can go through the supplemental pathway. This has seen a phenomenon called supplemental creep, where you got devices that have been old, that have been changed many times, and they never produce proper clinical data. What happens when you got a new device on the market? Well, first of all, the standard for approval for a new medication, it's overall robust for the FDA. You need two well-designed randomized controlled trials, and even the size of your non-inferiority margin is chosen by the FDA. A different system for Class 3 devices. It is known, and there is a concern that there is a low standard of evidence that is required for this. Often manufacturers don't have to prove improvement in clinical outcome or life expectancy, and the clinical trials can use surrogate endpoints. What about monitoring once they are on the market? Well, there is the MODE database, Manufacturer and User Facilitated Device Experience, which is open to public, and everybody can report, but there are limitations for this too. But firstly, the reporting is voluntary for the stakeholders. Secondly, the data is incomplete, is usually unverified, and is possibly biased. Doctors are afraid to report problems with off-label use because of liability. The FDA does not have the total number of devices implanted, the denominator, so at any time cannot do the incidence of a problem. There is a new entity, or a relatively new entity, it's a separate entity, it's a private enterprise, and it's called Device Events. It uses the same database, but using modern algorithm of data searching, and it appears to be more accurate than the FDA-owned MODE database. So, how many adverse events we had in 2015 in the United States? The Brookings Institution, in their report, said estimated 3,000 deaths and 50,000 serious adverse events from these devices. Well, it didn't add up because the FDA had received reports for 16,000 deaths during the same period. And then you got the Government Accountability Office that found out that 99% of device-related adverse events are not reported, so this number could be much greater. But also, there is no device identifiable track and recall reliable program. Let's see an example. A shoe is a coil that was designed to go in the fallopian tube to cause scarring and to provide sterilization. It was meant to be a safer and easier method for sterilization. The MODE had identified only a few hundred adverse events for this. The device events on the same database identified thousands of reported bleeding, infections, perforations, and reoperations. They looked at how the FDA had approved this device in 2002, and it had been approved to on the basis of a high success rate for 507 patients with 1-year follow-up. Does this ring any bells? 2-year follow-up, only a fraction of the patients. 3-year follow-up, even a smaller fraction of the patients. This device eventually was black box. The problem is that in the process of this, there were patients who were suffering harm, and you need a rapid system in which you can actually stop that as soon as you can. So the recall system actually affects a lot of patients. But there is also a political environment. For instance, in 1988, President Reagan changed the position of the FDA commissioner from a civil servant to a political appointee. To some, that meant the beginning of the end of the independence of the FDA. There was a case in 2008, Regal versus Medtronic, where the Supreme Court ruling said that an individual cannot sue the manufacturer directly if there is a problem with the device, as long as that device has been approved by the FDA. And in the 21st Century Cure Act from Obama was aimed to speed marketing. Industries can now produce only real-world data sometimes without randomized trials, including case reports, observational data, subgroup analysis. The bottom line is that there are problems with the FDA, and the solution is possible, and it goes down two major lines. Policy, in trying to establish the independence, and funding, to make sure that the FDA can do the job it's supposed to do. It's a theme that's gone through so far, and that's been a little bit the elephant in the room, and it's about the conflicts of interest. What I'm going to show you is a clip from a recent BBC Newsnight investigation, which was run for a clinical trial, but in this particular case, it addresses the issue of conflicts of interest. Let's see what she's got to say.
For the people on the clinical trial, the investigators on the clinical trial declared personal fees from stent manufacturers, and a third of those on the guidelines task force, so the people writing the guidelines. One of them on the guidelines task force had even declared he'd received license fee payments for patents on stents. Now, all this is within the rules, but it does feed into a much bigger debate around these conflicts of interest and financial relationships between these big stent manufacturers and clinicians, particularly if it has an impact on patient safety.
Undeclared conflicts of interest has been a problem for many years. This is a report from the New York Times in 2008, where a renowned child psychiatrist had earned 1.6 million in consultant fee and forgot to report them. And it's scandals like this that drove two changes in this country. One was the legislation for transparency, the Sunshine Act, and two was the request from Congress, from the Institute of Medicine, to get involved in managing and giving advice about how to manage conflicts of interest, particularly when making clinical guidelines. So let's see this a little bit more in detail. So the Institute of Medicine in 2009, first of all, said that patients and the public benefit when physicians and researchers collaborate with pharma and medical device companies to develop products that benefit individuals and public health. We all agree with that. Also defined a conflict of interest as circumstances that create a risk that professional judgment or actions regarding a primary interest will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. So a primary interest is what we do for a living, conducting research, taking care of patients, or medical education. But the secondary interest is when we want individual gain, either financial, professional, political, interpersonal. It's important to note individual gain is not just financial. There are a number of other areas of potential conflicts of interest which we need to take into account. Let's just look at the financial, because it is easy to measure. This is data from the Open Payment Database in 2018, open to the public, and there is 9.35 billion total US value given to 627,000 physicians, with general payments accounting for 1.7 billion. General payments are usually for consultancy fees or for entertainment, but also 1.4 billion value of ownership investment of interest. We reached a point where there is a lot of declaration, but sometimes you can find a paper where the actual declaration of interest is much bigger than the actual abstract of the paper. And you want to wonder whether there is, what effect does he have to the interpretation of the data. But payments are also received by chief in blue and associate in red editors, so major journals, and you can see on the x-axis the major journal from allergy, cardiology, and so on. I've drawn an arbitrary line here for $50,000, and you can see that there are lots of dots above $50,000 of chief and associate editors, so major journals that receive direct payment. What about the guidelines? Well, in a place where you can match what's disclosed by clinicians with what's actually disclosed through the open system, and this is a study looking at 9 guidelines between 16 and 17, looking at the difference between what authors had disclosed and what was disclosed by industry at the ACC AHA guidelines. But the big size is what the company reported. This is what the authors reported, and this is where they overlapped. So there seems to be a disconnect between what authors report, which is smaller than what the companies report. Now, some people will challenge it because will say, actually, sometimes the companies also report the $3 that they pay us for a sandwich when we go to a meeting, and they're not really relevant. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. However, this wasn't the case here. If you look at the bars, you'll see these are the classifications of these conflicts of interest: consultation, research, ownership. In red is the median amount of financial support with the interquartile range, and the black is the underreported from the physician point of view. So it's not irrelevant. What about the meals? Do a small meal, a couple of meals can influence the mentality of a physician and increase the support and a bias towards the support of the industry that provides the meal? Well, this is a study looking at pharmaceutical industry-sponsored meals by physicians and looking at the prescribing pattern on 4 drugs. Here you've got where there is no meal, and these are general practitioners, presumably, or physicians who are not receiving any meals, but even up to 4 meals exposure per year actually seems to influence, even subconsciously, the prescribing habit and the percentage of prescribing habits. So we have to ask to ourselves, by just declaring the conflict of interest with some subconscious bias, is that enough? That's a good question. Or we are in a case like Upton Sinclair that thinks that actually there is no way when you got a conflict of interest that you can detach yourself. So the process of production of clinical guidelines provides an important opportunity for scrutinizing the clinical evidence. The guidelines process must minimize the bias and the influence of conflicts of interest. That's what the Institute of Medicine said. And the methodology for developing trustworthy guidelines, that's an important statement from the Institute of Medicine, was described and which recommends a number of steps to minimize the bias by using systematic literature search around a predefined clinical question, a transparent and robust management of conflicts of interest, the adoption of a statistical methodological unit to prepare evidence tables, guided interpretation of the data, and more recently, the use of the grade system. So we have 2 scenarios here. We have scenario A, where there is a subject matter expert, which is funded by industry, but also writes the guideline, or we have complete separation. And the art is to be balanced. But more importantly, the advent and having a methodologist can help reducing some of this bias. Let's see an example. This is a meta-analysis of all the trials of TAVI versus SAVA, which was published as a fast track in the European Society of Cardiology own journal. The conclusions were that when you compare surgical aortic valve with TAVI, this is associated with a reduction in all-cause mortality and stroke up to 2 years. That's an important paper that could help in a guideline process driving the recommendations for what to use. But was there any problem? Well, the author said a choice of 2 things. You've got the randomized data for the patients here in green, or you got the S-treated. First of all, notice in the S-treated patients, there is a significant loss to follow-up, which is more marked for the patients with surgical aortic valve. Which data set do you think the authors used? They used the S-treated cohort. Had they used the randomized cohort, or at least used also the randomized cohort, they would have shown that the odds ratio have shown no difference at all. So from a methodological point of view, this is not the way to analyze these, while this is a methodologically more sound way with all the other bias that is possible. Well, we can ask ourselves a question. This is very topical. Is left main coronary artery disease a separate entity that needs separate clinical recommendation and a separate treatment from the rest of coronary surgery? To have that, you've got to demonstrate that left main is, firstly, a statistical different subgroup. Therefore, that means the effect of the treatment is different in the subgroup from the rest of the coronary surgery. And secondly, also needs to be a biological separate subgroup from the population of coronary artery disease. Well, the first answer came from the paper, the meta-analysis published in Lancet in 2018 of 11 trials, 11,000 patients, that demonstrated an overall effect positive for CABG versus PCI of 1.2 or 20% at 5 years. But also when they tried to look at the subgroup, they didn't demonstrate really a subgroup statistical for left main, and they couldn't, because 80% of the patients in the trials with left main also have a multivessel disease. The CAS registry also demonstrates the same stuff. So it's not a separate group. So what could we do? For instance, We could just look at all the evidence again that is available. You look at the Syntax 2 years, the Excel 5-year all-cause mortality, the Noble all-cause mortality, and you find remarkably the same effect as the meta-analysis done in 2018. So it is possible that you don't have this, and it's also probably not a good thing to try and do some meta-analysis of all the left main trials when the left mains are not even subgroups. Some food for thought. I have had my personal experience with data, which I'd like to share with you. And again, this is about doing a study and trying to have some debate. We ran a series of studies to look whether there was any difference in outcomes between weekends and weekday admissions in hospitals. We published in 2015 a reanalysis, a refresh of data that we published also in 2012, which showed that after adjustment for risk, there was a significantly higher chance of dying at 30 days if you were admitted in a hospital on a Saturday or on a Sunday, and also a small but still statistically significant effect for Monday and for Friday. But it was not just an England problem. We also analyzed the data for 256 United healthcare systems in US, and the answer ratio is very similar. So we have now unexplained deaths associated with weekend admissions. This was called the weekend effect, and by applying the estimate additional risk to the observed death, we estimated 11,000 extra deaths per year on the admissions from Friday to Monday and 8,000 from Saturday to Sunday. How did we interpret the data? We said, and I would invite you to remember this phrase because it may come back a little bit later in the presentation. We said it is not possible to ascertain the extent to which these excess deaths may be preventable. To assume that they are avoidable would be rash and misleading. But also, we recognized from an epidemiological perspective that this statistics was not otherwise ignorable. So this hit the general press. 11,000 deaths, we got to do something about it. In the previous iteration of the paper, NHS Improvement have started a 7-day service recommending their clinical standards to improve the care of patients at weekend. The Conservative Party took this pledge in the manifesto, which meant it would be funded if the Conservative Party was elected, and they essentially particularly wanted to ensure that patients can see a general practitioner between 8 a.m., 8 p.m., 7 days a week, and wanted to turn the health service in a truly 7-day. Publication was flying high. We were very happy with this. We thought that the sun was shining, thought that the sea was blue, and we were sailing blissfully without knowing that actually a storm was brewing. Whilst protracted and difficult contract negotiations between the government, the British Medical Association, which is the doctors' union, and the hospital doctors were progressing with difficulty, Jeremy Hunt, the Secretary of State for Health, I should say Right Honourable Jeremy Hunt, made a speech on the 16th of July 2015, 2 months before our second paper was published, and he was quoting that there were 6,000, and he said, avoidable deaths, remember what we said earlier, and for this reason, he wanted to review the doctors' contracts in the hospital. And of course, immediately, the conspiracy theory started, that the study had been commissioned for a purpose, and everybody was asking, where did Jeremy Hunt get the figure for 6,000? The Department of Health made a statement about the 6,000 figures, quoting a paper that is about to be published in the BMJ. I wrote an email. The email became public on the BBC, and the email said, to the Department of Health, I was raising the issue that the paper had not been published, it was inaccurate to quote 6,000 deaths, and so on. So we're setting me against the Secretary of State from Health. When the paper was published, Fiona Godley, the editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, wrote directly to the Secretary of State and said, I'm writing to register my concern about the way in which you have publicly misrepresented an academic article published in the BMJ. I ask you to publicly clarify the statements that you made in relation to these articles. This in the press. Jeremy Hunt was accused of skewing weekend hospital death rates. The political atmosphere was boiling. Doctors were unhappy, British Medical Association were unhappy. We were blamed for this because of the paper that we published. And finally, this led to a strike, the first junior doctor strike since the 70s. What you're seeing here is the House of Commons. It's a Wednesday afternoon. On Wednesday afternoon, you have something called Prime Minister Question Time, where the leader of the opposition, in this case, Jeremy Corbyn, can ask David Cameron, the Prime Minister, questions. Let's see what questions they asked in this session.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, this dispute with the junior doctors has been on the basis of misrepresented research about weekend mortality. I'll read the Prime Minister what the researchers themselves say, and I quote, "It is not possible to ascertain the extent to which these excess deaths may be preventable. To assume they are avoidable would be rash and misleading." So is the Prime Minister and his Health Secretary being rash and misleading with these figures?
Yes. Let me agree with the right honourable gentleman about something, which is this dispute has been plagued by scaremongering and inaccurate statistics. The British Medical Association, in their first intervention, said that this was a 30% pay cut. That was completely untrue. In fact, it was so untrue that they had to take their pay calculator off their website and they never put it back up again. Now let me answer very directly the question about excess deaths. The 6,000 figure for excess deaths was based on a question asked by the Health Secretary to Sir Bruce Keogh, the medical director of the NHS. Now we've had time to go into these figures in more detail. I can tell the House this, that the Health Secretary was indeed guilty. He was guilty of an understatement. The true figures for excess deaths at the weekend are 11,000, not 6,000. So perhaps the right honourable gentleman will now withdraw his totally unjustified attack on the Health Secretary. Will he withdraw it now he knows the figures?
So we wanted to have some debate. So we've seen a journey so far about the importance of data, the importance of data that is misleading, making wrong decisions. I think we're coming to an end now, and here I'm going to give you some of my reflections along side of the issues and the problems that I have experienced in the last few months. In the past few months, we have seen the evidence from a clinical trial called into question. Issues of data robustness and transparency have been raised, which led the European Association of Cardiothoracic Surgery to withdraw its support from part of the clinical guidelines it did jointly with another association. Some may even ask whether we are witnessing an isolated episode or the hallmark of a systematic problem. Clinical trials are only possible thanks to the generosity of patients who altruistically agree to take part in the expectation that their participation will advance science and improve outcomes for future patients. We must not abuse that trust. How we respond to erroneous evidence defines our professionalism as individuals, corporations, and scientific associations. The way forward is not easy. First, we must have robust mechanisms for managing conflicts of interest in which the profession and the public can have confidence. Declarations must be complete and transparent. Second, we must ensure that trials are conducted with rigor and transparency. Meticulous care must be adopted to ensure that the resulting data are robust and the guidelines we produce can be trusted by those who use them. Difficult judgments have to be made, but we must have confidence that these are made in the patient's best interest. The data that trials produce are the building blocks of medical knowledge. They are part of the legacy we leave for future generations of doctors and patients. We owe it to our members and their patients to ensure that the answers we produce are the best we can do, and that there is no basis for any suspicion that the results have been distorted by vested interest and scientifically flawed decision-making. I'd like to thank once again Bob Higgins, the STS and the organizer, and I'd like to thank you for listening to me.
Well done. Awesome. Really well done.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Picture? Some picture? Take a picture?
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pagano, for a provocative and stimulating presentation. I think it honors Dr. Ferguson's legacy, and we're really proud that you shared your reflections with us. I want to say thank you for all joining us here this afternoon. I hope you found today's sessions stimulating, intriguing, enlightening, as did I. We are going to adjourn at this moment, and the STS members will start to head over to the Great Hall B next door for our important business meeting, where we'll elect new officers and board members and present this year's Distinguished Service Awards. I want to say thank you again. Look forward to seeing you a little later in the day. Thank you.